good morning, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you're sitting and listening to this broadcast. Today, we bring you three outstanding individuals, some of the smartest and brightest people on this side of the planet, to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I would like to start with quick introductions, a little bit about their background and why this work is important to them. Donna, let's start with you.
Good afternoon. My name is Donna Sims Wilson, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of CA Capital Management. We're an African-American owned firm in the alternative space in the mortgage credit. And I am the immediate past president of the National Association of Securities Professionals, or NASP, a trade organization of minorities and women who work on Wall Street in asset management, investment banking, and the like. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Happy to be here today.
Welcome. Donna, why is diversity, equity, inclusion important, particularly to you and the space in which you serve?
Investment banking and asset management are two key wealth generation engines in our country. And sadly, women and minorities, and especially minorities, as my grandmother might have said, all of us put together are the hair on the pimple of the behind of the elephant. I mean, that's how significant all of our institutions are together. Diverse firms need to have an opportunity. They need to have a seat at the table to prove what they can do and to generate wealth for their communities.
You know, Donna, I had the privilege of working at Hewitt Associates before it was acquired by Aon. And one of the things that it was an HR outsourcing consulting firm specializing in human resources and consulting. And at the time, Ariel Investments was one of our largest investors at 180 million shares, Don Rogers, Melanie Hobson. And we did a study with them on the participation rate in 401k for women and people of color. And what we saw the difference was culture, that African Americans, Latinos, were saving at a much slower rate than that of their white counterparts because of their culture, their background, many caring for their aging parents and putting kids through schools, supporting their communities and their churches, didn't see the benefits of long-term savings. And then we looked at Latinos and they would say they were bad son or daughter if they did not invest in for their parents or their relatives did not save. What we saw on the upside was we thought that heterosexual white male would have been the role model for savings and investment, but we saw the Asian community. They oversave, overinvest, and overinsure because they knew they were going to care for their aging parents. You very seldom see Asians in nursing homes. So we talk about culture and we talk about corporations, and that work was eye-opening to Hewitt, and we were able to share that data with 56 of our largest clients. And at the time, Don Thompson was president of McDonald's. We shared that data with McDonald's. They gave their employees a $1 raise and a $1 match. We shared it with the bottling company for Pepsi. They also eliminated, instead of, they had 5 loans. So people were taking loans to get loans, to pay loans, to get loans. And bottom line, they did was reduce the number of loans they could take out and gave them a $500 grant to try to close their gap in that. So those are cutting edge things that we did more than a decade ago, to be honest. And we still see those trends. How important is it for Fortune 500 companies to go beyond looking at suppliers on food and beverage and housekeeping and janitorial services to look at agencies that are Black to help them with financial planning, with 401k, other types of investments or things in your space? How important is that to have a Black firm? And is there an opportunity?
Sure. No, it's very important to have a Black firm. It's interesting that you mentioned Ariel Investments because John Rogers is a champion, Melody as well, in allowing diverse firms to have an opportunity and a seat at the table to ply their trade. And as it relates to investing, many African Americans especially don't grow up talking about stocks and bonds and other investments around the dinner table. It's just not what it is that we do. And so to expose our kids through internship programs and to interest them in investing is critically important. You also mentioned data. You mentioned what you did 20 years ago. Well, in the last few years, there's some very interesting things that are happening with data right now as it relates to the investment industry. The SEC, for example, has an asset management advisory committee chaired by a gentleman by the name of Gilbert Garcia, who owns a Hispanic-owned investment management firm called Garcia Hamilton. And this particular asset management advisory committee is looking at supplier diversity, if you will, for diverse firms and their ability to manage the $70+ trillion worth of assets that are represented in the retirement industry in the United States, both public and private, corporate retirement plans. Then there's something called the Diversity Data Accountability Act that Congresswoman Waters and Congresswoman Beatty have done, where they have sent informational request letters to, I believe, the 31 largest asset management firms in the country, asking them about how are you utilizing diverse asset management firms, diverse investment banking firms in your industry. In the foundation and endowment space, the Diverse Asset Manager Initiative has a website up where they are cataloging, I guess this was through Reverend Al Sharpton initially, contacting all of the foundations and endowments, university foundations, et cetera, asking them how are they utilizing diverse asset management firms, diverse investment banking firms in their business. And then, of course, there are the league tables, which show the participation of diverse investment banking firms and all of the plethora of underwritings and other transactions that are occurring in the capital markets today. So our trade organization, NASP, has many, many members who are very active on both the asset management and the investment banking side, and seek an opportunity to grow their businesses.
Donna, that's a very good point. And I recently heard Maxine Waters talk about what she's doing in her role. It starts at the top. So government plays a big role in this. What are some of the things that she's doing to really advance the work? You touched on a little bit. What else is she doing to advance this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion in risk management?
In financial services. Maxine Waters, who I've had the privilege to know literally since I was 17 years old.
Oh, wow.
She was in the California state legislature, and I was on the California State Board of Education. So that was a long time ago. But Congresswoman Waters has probably single-handedly been the most impactful legislator in the financial services industry as it relates to diversity and inclusion. And it goes all the way back to the savings and loan crisis of 1989, the creation of the Resolution Trust Corporation, the second great financial crisis of 2008. All along the way, she has passed laws, probably the most impactful, most recent being Dodd-Frank, Section 342. But there were many laws before that impacted how Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and other GSEs work with diverse firms in investment banking and in asset management. And so she is just a champion and a lion. And I wish we had 50 more of her. We could clone her 50 times.
50 times, right?
The U.S. would be all right. Okay.
Yeah. Donna, you mentioned the Dodd-Frank Act. Talk about that. Explain to our guests today or listeners today, what does that really mean?
Yeah. So the Dodd-Frank Act was put in place to do a lot of things after the great financial crisis of 2008, 7, 8, 9, and there. But Section 342 created something called the Offices of Minority and Women Inclusion, and all of these major government agencies, the Treasury, the FDIC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the National Credit Union Administration, all of these different agencies where this particular Office of Minority and Women Inclusion was to have a seat at the table where policies and decisions were made to ensure that diverse people had an opportunity. Because what so often happens, and I'm not going to name names, but especially during a crisis, there are a handful of mega firms who are literally right there at the table as the law is being passed. And then as soon as the ink is dry, an RFP goes out that is written so narrowly that only maybe the 5 largest firms in the world can even apply. And Congresswoman Waters worked on Section 342 of Dodd-Frank to say this stops now. Everybody has to have an opportunity to share their ideas because, for example, in a crisis, A lot of things have to happen that have never been done before. So if it's never been done before, then no one has a monopoly on great ideas, right? And it's just who has an opportunity to get their idea heard and then implement it. So that's just one point.
Great point, Donna. We're going to circle back because one last question I'm going to hear from other panelists as well. But Donna, as an everyday average employee, right? What role, responsibility do we have in order to advocate for change within organizations as we talk about financial planning, financial literacy? What vendors? What can we do in our day-to-day response? You know, as an everyday average person, how can we move the organization to be more conscious about doing business with Black businesses?
Well, I think it's where you sit, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so if you are seated in the C-suite, there's a lot that you can do. And let me just talk about that for just a second. Best practices, we have found that diverse firms have the most opportunity to compete and win business when the tone is set at the top and the CEO empowers the direct reports and then ties their compensation to the amount of business that's done with diverse firms or the amount of diverse hires. So there has to be metrics because what is measured is what can be managed. And then to further along the line, what is managed can be rewarded with compensation if the goals are met. So a direct line between that person's comp and the end goal, we have found, is the surest and most direct way to ensure significant participation.
That's wonderful, wonderful. Again, we want to make sure we're reaching our audience from executives to day-to-day workers and how we all play a role. I believe that we solve for one, it benefits all. I also believe that we have, this is head, heart, and guts work, right? We're going to have to really look at this in a very different way. So thank you for sharing. Damone Lester, let's move on to you and talk about the automotive industry and car dealerships and credit and what does that mean? And we as a culture of Black people, we enjoy nice things. But in order to get nice things, we got to have a good credit rating, right? We want to do that. Let's talk a little bit about you, your background, and then we'll go into a little more questions after that.
Oh, well, thank you, Tyrone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Rainbow Push. It's Damon Lester. So
I'm sorry, Damon. Sorry.
No worries, man. And so I am the president of the National Association of Minority Automobile Dealers, and we are headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area. And our mission is to achieve parity within the minority dealership ranks. Currently, there are about 18,000 new car dealerships, and out of that, there are only about 1,245 that are owned by ethnic minorities. That's African American, Asian, Latino, and Native American. To cut that 1,200 up, you have the African American dealer counts about 260 out of 18,000. And so the association was created and co-founded by Reverend Jackson and others. But the association mission is to increase the number of minority-owned dealerships in the U.S. And so what we use data. We know that over 30% of all new cars and trucks are purchased by a minority. Of that 30%, about 11% are purchased by African Americans. So to give you another dollar amount or a figure to it, is I'll use 2019, there are about 17 million vehicles sold. 11% of that footprint was purchased by African Americans. Wow. And so that's a huge amount of market share. And as we know that the minority community will become the majority community by 2045, that market share will continue to increase year over year. And so we work with every automobile manufacturer in the country from Volkswagen to Toyota and to present the business case for diversity and inclusion from an economic standpoint. The challenge of why there's 18,000 versus why we're only at 1,200 versus the 18,000 is that we weren't allowed to become dealers till the post-civil rights movement. And so we were late at the starting line. And so trying to catch up, we have that economic gap there that others were able to reap those benefits. And so
let me just pause here. What you described is systematic racism.
Yeah.
right? We're 450 years behind every other demographic. When people talk about equity and equality, we're 400 years plus behind. It's like, I think, playing a game of Monopoly and going around the board. And every time you go around the board, our white counterparts are collecting $200, we're collecting zero. Right. And as they're collecting $200, they're building homes, they're buying railroads, they're buying utilities. And the very first time we go across the $200, we land on their property and we pay them, and we don't have enough to pay them. We do what? We go to jail. Right, but they're still making money. So again, that systematic racism piece that plays out in that you just described so elegantly. You really talk about those are barriers, and I think that goes back in Donna's industry as well. Having access to money, having access to education, having access to being able to manage money from others. We're so far behind. There has to be some intervention to occur to provide equity. And unfortunately, the death and murder of George Floyd has brought us to this point in time. What difference have you seen since the murder of George Floyd, with all the commitments and dollars attached that corporations are giving, and talking about doubling representation and increased representation? What have you seen in your industry?
Wow, I think we saw a lot of really good press releases, right? And so that's across all industries, not just auto. We saw it, everybody. It then it started to give the appearance like, okay, I need to hurry up and get one out too, because my competitor got one out. Sure. And so you see a lot of rhetoric. And now I think as a year and a half has gone by, since those press releases or commitments were made, you're seeing a lot more discussion from on auto, but the execution is still the same as it was pre. And so the issue is, okay, if we want to go to the point of you believe in D&I, diversity and equity and inclusion, you know that there's an issue, you know that we don't have there's a lack of C-suite executives from the employee ranks. We know that the dealer body is not as significant as the non-minority dealer body. What are you going to do, and what's the plan? As Donna mentioned, I'm using your phrase, it'd be measured and managed, right? And so you got to come up with a goal. And so we challenged them on, if you have all of these great marketing schemes or make great marketing commercials to gear or market to us, but we can't buy, and you want us not to own what you sell. And so it's a challenge for us to try to overcome some obstacles, and the obstacle is access and capital. That's been an age-old access and issue for us, and like other industries, but we've seen an increase in dialogue, but an execution of it is kind of staying flat. And we need to make sure, from our standpoint, is they have to put dollars to what their words are. And that's where we've seen, there's still a challenge, or there's this push and pull type deal. And Donna, you may not remember, you and I met in Congresswoman Waters' office in 2008 when they were writing Dodd-Frank.
Okay, I believe it. I believe it.
And we sat in her office for quite a while, going over that. And so, Congresswoman Waters has just been a blessing to us, the association, and to me as well, as being a friend throughout the years. But her advocacy and support of trying to bring some parity and equality across the board has just definitely been key.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and I think that we can't fix what we're not willing to face. Right, the data is there. Donna talked about the data. You talked about the data. You can't fix it until people really don't want to face the reality of the deficit between Blacks versus white. Right, we've been taught to ignore, suppress those differences. But if we don't lean into those differences, we're not going to move ahead. I believe that most corporations have the will. They don't have the skill. We have to help them develop the skill to be able to deliver on the promises which they made. It goes back to Donna's comment from her grandmother about the pimple on the back of the elephant's butt, Aries' butt. No one wants to touch it, right? I can talk about giving 100,000, 220,000. I can talk about the dollars, but where is the proof, right? To Donna's point, how do we measure and manage what we measure to get the results that we're getting? But it goes, James, down to marketing and how we tell the story and how we actually show up. James, let's talk about how we can communicate these messages by partnering with Black firms. I want to play a game with everyone. I want you to take your cell phone devices. I want you to Google cute baby, and I want you to see what you come up with. If you Google it, tell me what you see, page after page after page. And I'm going to ask our panelists to reveal before we go to James. And James is going to tell us why we see this.
Lots of Caucasian babies.
Lots of Caucasian babies. Same thing over and over again, white baby after white baby. So we are a victim, and corporations are not partnering with Black firms, putting images into the system. That's what's pulled up by the World Wide Web. So James, how important it is to have Black agencies helping to solve this issue around imagery and what we see in the marketplace?
Well, thank you, Tyrone. And before I answer your question, what I'd like to do is sort of step back a little bit because Rainbow Push has had the great foresight to bring together three trade associations. And many of the folks in the audience probably are not familiar with the world of trade associations. I want to sort of step back and give you an overview of who NABB is and why we exist. NABB is the National Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters. We were formed in 1976 with two goals: to increase the number of African Americans who own radio and television stations, and to improve the business climate in which we operate. And what that means is exactly what Damon and Don have been talking about. Is there are so few of us in the area of broadcasting that we are that tiny pimple, and what that meant in 1976 when NABB was formed, there were 30 African American owned radio stations in the entire United States out of at that time about 10,000 radio stations, and there were no African American owned television stations at that time. So the issues we addressed then were very, very significant. And fortunately, we were at the tail end of the first civil rights movement. And in 1978, the FCC adopted a minority ownership policy to address that problem. And as a result of that minority ownership policy, from 1978, where we had, by 1978, we were 32 radio stations and 1 television station. By 1995, we had grown 250 radio stations and 25 television stations. However, in 1995, Congress was taken over by the Newt Gingrich, the contract with America. And the first thing they did was repeal the FCC's minority ownership policy. Since that date, we've seen our numbers dwindle to where we're now only 180 radio stations out of what's now 11,000 radio stations in the United States. So what you find when you talk about your question, Tyrone, about marketing, is the first problem is there's so few of us. And secondarily, you've got a situation where the major corporations all do business by using major advertising agencies. Those major advertising agencies are notorious for having little or no minority representation in the C-suites.
Yes.
And as a result, they do business in a manner that excludes most African American advertising agencies and minority-owned media. So when you talk about the cute baby problem, it's all once again is related to institutional racism. You've got institutions that neglect the African American community and most other minority communities. So it starts there. I mean, the issues that Damon's talked about, Donna's talked about, they're all the same issues in every industry that we're addressing here.
So how do we overcome that, right? So what do we do to help solve for the lack of awareness, the lack of understanding, the lack of getting involved? How can we use media and advertising to close the gap? Because I think we're the most admired culture on the planet. We're the most emulated culture on the planet. We spend more money in every industry. Why is it we can't get corporations to help advertise with Black firms?
We are now in a post George Floyd period. So we are in a new, and I don't know how long, but we are in a new civil rights period right now, I would call it, where as everyone was talking about, there have been a whole lot of press releases promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion by every major corporation, including the major advertising agencies, as well as the major advertisers. The question is, which of them will actually follow through? We have seen At NABB, we've seen some great follow through from a couple of different places. Procter and Gamble, which is the leading advertiser in the country, and they have really been stepping out and putting their money where their mouth is to use Black-owned media. And this, and needless to say, this is all a very new concept that, for many years, agencies and advertisers have talked about doing, targeting Black consumers, which is something that they have used white-owned agencies and white-owned media companies to do. So you get a handful of nice commercials on television, on the major networks, but in terms of actually doing business with Black-owned media, this is a new emphasis that's really just come about within the last year. So we're hoping to see some positive results, but there's still yet to come for many places.
I still struggle, right, a little bit with what I see the images on television, right? You have these white agencies who are attempting to do right, but don't understand Black culture. You now see Black women with natural hair as if all Black women wear natural hair, right? You see images of multicultural, more the fair complected. You don't really show the spectrum of Blacks, right? They've taken Black faces and taken white images and put Black faces on white images. So it really is not getting to the true core. Absent that I use an example. I was with an organization the other day and they were sharing their images and they had taken backgrounds and they took the same image of backgrounds and images for whites and put Black faces on them. But there was a Black woman with her natural hair and she was standing in a field of cotton.
What?
Now, everybody on this call gets it, right? But nobody in the room, nobody in the room saw that but me. And I was thinking, you're not going to tell me she's standing in a field of cotton. It was like a field of cotton. That tree with those white spot, that's cotton. Right. So it's important that we understand that while they can take the images and shade the faces and change the hairstyles, but the context in which they're showing it still has a bias. And it still minimizes, and it actually supports stereotypes. There have been commercials that have been pulled off of television because of that lack of cross-cultural competence, that inability to really go deep in culture to understand. James, why is that still the case? Have they not learned?
No, because what you're seeing is as I said, when you look at the advertising agencies, there's not a wider industry in America, and so you've got a room full of white creative people who are told by their clients, we want to reach the African American consumer, and so a handful of white creative people will decide how that's done, and very, very frequently they get it wrong. Just like this woman in the field of cotton, and they don't have the cultural awareness because they're not of our culture.
Right.
Not of our culture.
And so as long as that's the case, until we get, so it's really the ad agencies, they have to start at the top at the CEO level, all the way down to the most junior people. They've got to get people of color into these offices, and it's this is. In the last 6 months, we've seen a lot of press releases about doing that. It's going to take time, and it's going to take serious commitment at the top to make that happen. And
I use
the process.
I think you're right. This is not a destination, but a journey. It's going to take some time. We didn't get overnight. We're going to resolve it overnight. So there's some patience that we have to give and some grace, right, that we have to give one another. But you still see, I share an example in my consulting days, consulted with a company that was rolling out some detergent at bleach. And we prototyped it with a group of suburban white women. And then prototype with a group of Black women. And the image was an African-American male laying on a bed of white sheets with white underwear and a baby on his chest with a white diaper, and he had his hand patting the baby and had a wedding ring on. The white women said, oh, this is nice. When we shared with the Black women, they roared. Amazing, it's great. We like white clothes too, right? He's married and he has a ring. It demonstrated something more than that you see of Black images that are not necessarily positive. Right. So, but they had a Black agency that worked with them to make sure they're depicting Blacks in a specific way that only Blacks could resonate. The white women never saw the wedding ring. They never thought about the baby laying on his chest. They never thought about we like white linen too. Those things that resonate, and their target audience were Black consumers. Right. And so when you look at that, it's unpacking that, really understand what are the cultural differences that we're missing. So we talk about whether it's financial literacy, we talk about risk management, we talk about credit, we talk about cars. There is a subtle bias, why do you think that bias exists? And that's for all of our panelists. Speaking of, why do you think that bias, why is that pimple still being avoided that Donna's grandmother told us about? Why is that the case? Is it fear? Is it lack of understanding?
It's fear, man. I mean, no one wants to feel like someone's going to take their job. And I think when you heard that what happened over the past, 15, 18 months was, there was this big, huge diversity push. We wanted a huge amount of C-suite people, but, we're saying, it could be perceived that, hey, get rid of all of those that currently and just replace them. And so what the interviews that I've done in the past is just to kind of prevent that fear or deter that fear and say, we're trying to add to, we're not trying to take away, right? But until you give access and you put people at the table and provide that there is a ceiling versus the floor, we only know where the floor is, that then you're not giving anybody hope that you can achieve that type of level. And so, diversity is growth, but people get a little anxiety when they think that something's going to be taken away versus you're growing the opportunity.
Absolutely. And the data doesn't lie. In the financial world, Donna knows the data doesn't lie. Nothing speaks louder than zero. But now the data that by 2025, the minority will be the majority. Yep. You got 80 million baby boomers transition out of the workforce. National record workers are 40 million. People are fearful. What about me? And Blacks have never said we try to create exclusion. We just want to be included. We want to be included to get our share of the pie, our part of the pie. So the data is king, as said. But Donna, why do you think people are so upset about the shifting of the demographics and why it's changing and the power is changing? What's your thought in your industry?
Wow. So in my industry, sadly, power has not yet, it has not changed. So that's the first thing, is that, the wealth in America is still held in very close hands. And that's, and even though African Americans control and greatly influence large pools of capital, namely public pension funds, and there has been some movement in diverse firms being able to manage more assets for public pension funds. Largely still today in 2021, things are more the same. They're not, we haven't progressed dramatically.
Right. Yeah.
Now, one bright spot since George Floyd is, I understand that in the last 12 to 18 months, over 300 African Americans have been placed on publicly traded corporate boards. Really? Wow. 300 in the last 18 months or so. And, and I think the statistic that I saw, I was in another meeting recently where maybe it was like 65 the year before. And so that is something that people decided this is what we're going to do. And there's been a lot of activity in the corporate board space. And so maybe if there are more people of color on corporate boards and have a voice and influence, then some changes can take place at the top. Don, I think that's great. The statistic says that when there's one person of color, I think one Black, he or she is constantly trying to defend themselves or prove themselves. Mm-hmm. When it's two, it becomes combative because there's only room for one. It doesn't level off until it's three, which is a critical mass. So we need more than just one to sit, mm-hmm. because we see it in, all of us are sitting on this call today have been the only one of at some point in some time. And we either working twice as hard or very aggravated that we can't get a word in, and there's no one to co-sign, support, endorse, or to move forward. So I am not of the class of just getting one. Yes, right. We got 300, but how many 300 times that are on together? Collectively, the power and the strength of this call today with the four of us from four different unique and distinct industries can pull together and show our network. But when it's one, again, it's very difficult to navigate appropriately. Now, I'm not saying it can't be done, because John Rogers, Melanie Hobson, Don Thompson, the list goes on, have made a tremendous amount of impact. Being the only one, because they've been very courageous, they've been delivered, and they're not operating in a place from fear.
right? They know that they are there for a reason. I had the privilege and honor to meet with John Lewis before he died. I says, how do we write this wrong? He said, just get it done. Just get it done. And I think we're at that place that we've admired, and I tell people we're admiring this issue around race, gender, and orientation. We're admiring this issue about the gap. We've admired far too long. What are we going to do?
Right.
And how are we going to get it? And when are we going to get it done? Not how, when are we going to get it done? So James, this, I'm really, I'm a visual learner and love to see, colors and fashions and things of nature. How can collectively, and I also, in my diversity training, I often use Black media to really showcase, because our news outlets are very different than our white counterparts. The things that I bring forward, and sometimes for the very first time that they would have heard. And we all know that George Floyd was not the first Black man that was murdered by the police. Right? But it was due to the pandemic and COVID-19, where people were isolated at their homes, watching television 24/7. And if it wasn't for the young digital native standing there with her cell phone, by the way, that was fully charged, is our Rosa Parks of this generation, we would not be in this conversation today. So how can we impose upon our white counterparts to be more exposed to Black radio and Black television and images that will represent us appropriately? What can we do?
That's an interesting question, because obviously for our white counterparts to take advantage of Black-owned media, whether it's broadcast, print, or online, they have to want to search out that media, and it's it's convenient for people to watch what they usually watch, or what they usually listen to. So I don't know that we're going to be able to get them to take advantage of our media. I think what we have to do is make them aware of the need to address, to make sure that that those people who are native to our media and want to have access to our media are given the opportunity to do that. And that I think is probably if they will do that, if they will put their advertising behind our media, so that because part of the problem, of course, is the reason why there are so few of us, and why so many of our companies are so small, is because those advertisers are not putting their advertising dollars with our companies, so that even those consumers who want to receive our content can't, because our stations are small, our signals are small, our newspapers don't reach very far, so it goes on and on. So I think if they would put their money where it needs to be to support our communities, I think that would be a very good start for all of them.
Good. Recently we marked a significant year of Black Wall Street, and we all know the story of Black Wall Street, where we had our own banks, our own agencies, et cetera, and we were demolished, we were terrorized, we were killed. Going back to Donna and a little bit about, in that I learned that we had Blacks that owned airplanes. Right, we had Blacks at everything back in that decade. What was the driving factor? Why couldn't we recover after that? Let
me interject before you go to Don. I just want to say I was in Tulsa this past weekend at the Memorial, reading all the information you were talking about the airplanes and the banks and all that we had. So it's very timely for you to raise that subject with me. So I just wanted to interject that for you.
Let's start there. You're current. Let's go what you just enlighten us all. I was going to go down the fight because of the banking. Back in that era, owning a Black bank and owning the business that we own was just we don't see it today as much. But there was a focused effort, right, to destroy, to just demise. What did you learn in your last visit at Tulsa? What did you see? What did you learn?
There were two Black pilots in Tulsa in 1921. They had airplanes that they used to fly white businessmen around to their weekend outings and retreats. You had as you said, the Black banks. They had there was, if you could name it, they had it there in Tulsa. I forget, I wish I remembered the numbers, but the number of businesses that were destroyed over that massacre were, just astronomical. The number of houses and homes that were destroyed, and I wish I remembered the numbers better. But also they had every kind of business you could think of.
#1 heart surgeons, #1 physicians that were in those country in that town that people were flying all over the country to visit. So it was really, I'm a firm believer that given the opportunity, giving the access, we will conquer. We will win and be best in class. And I think there's a fifth factor there. But do share what else you saw while you were there. How did that make you feel to go back in time and see and visit? What joy and satisfaction did you get?
What they had is they had survivor stories. So there were all these people who were interviewed who were 6, 7, and 8 years old at the time of the massacre, who were still alive when they were putting together the memorial, and they talked about the horror of what they saw, about the destruction of people coming into your home, killing your parents. You ran out the back door, then they burned the house, those kinds of things. I mean, it was the horrific nature of it is the heaviest thing you feel down there, because they had the survivor stories in such detail, and that was what. So you walk away feeling the dread of what they went through, and it's an important message for people to understand.
Yeah, it's man's inhumanity against man. But then if you
Exactly.
pivot to the financial side of it, it was a very prosperous place. People owned property and businesses, and they lost the opportunity to pass down that wealth to the next generation, the generation after, and the generation after. And and that's gone forever. And so, the capital that came from, owning a hotel in 1921, and the profits from that, if properly invested, for 50 years, 80 years, how much money would that be today, right? How much money? And so that capital, that wealth left the Black community forever. And as you could see, it was never rebuilt. Even in 2021, only thing that exists is a memorial to what happened, but nothing was ever regenerated there.
Correct.
Which is probably, the biggest tragedy of all.
And one of the things that I saw was that in the name of regenerating the area, there is money coming in, but it's coming in to build high-rise condos, to build it looks like every other urban renewal process we've ever seen, where urban renewal means Black removal. And this is exactly what when we were being led around that area, they were pointing out all these big condos coming in, and they said we doubt that our community is going to be buying those condos.
Right, because with what money are they going to buy it with?
Exactly.
Right.
What resources do we retain? At the end, wealth has been handed down to Donna's point, generation, which Damien talks about credit and how important credit is, and how we rebuild our credit, and not understanding. To Donna's point, when I grew up, my father was a truck driver, my mother was a registered nurse, but we never talked about savings and investment. We never talked about how my father grew his business. I was 13 when he died. I don't remember those conversations, right? I remember you go to work, you work hard, you go to school, you get education. Education is equalizer, but credit plays a big factor in what we get today. Talk me to about why that's still such a struggle for us.
Well, I'm sorry, Damon, go ahead.
No, go ahead, James. Go ahead, I'll jump in.
I was only going to give a very unfortunate example, because I have two very well-educated daughters, and I was talking to one of them. She was talking about paying her credit card bill, and I said, "Well, how much credit card debt do you have?" And she told me, and I said, "Well, why are you carrying that kind of credit card debt?" And she said, "Well, because it's convenient." I said, "But it's not smart." So, it was one of those situations where I said, I should have had this conversation with her long before she ever got her first credit card. So we managed to get through that conversation successfully, and she changed her habits there. But it's those kinds of things you're talking about, Tyrone, about the conversations that have to happen that oftentimes don't.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, I'm gonna chime in because I got a story just for when being in college. I remember at Temple, that first day of your freshman year, you know, you got all of these vendors lined up. Hey, you want a water bottle? Next thing you know, you get a gold card and you just spend away and you just lose it. So, I mean, it starts with the education of it, right? And so if you grow up without wealth or any access to wealth, or you grow up poor, the credit piece, this looks like gives you an opportunity to at least dream that you have something, right? So you use it, not looking at the ramifications long term. And so we don't have the education piece locked down yet. And I think it's definitely got better because they don't do that part of the get free credit cards anymore. But you know, I think ultimately we just have to collectively do a better job of educating, because it's, you know, everything, particularly if you're in the first generation of creating wealth, right? It's hard to figure that part out because you're just trying to get yourself situated as well. And
you know, it's funny. It's funny you say that. I too was a recipient after graduating high school of an American Express. You know, and I went out and shopped. Little did I know that payment had to follow. Nobody told me, right, that I had to pay a bill, right? And I got generous and gave a friend of mine. You can give a friend, family, or friend a credit card. I gave one to a good friend of mine, knowing. Right?
Oh boy.
You know, I gave it to my grandmother, and she's down. I bought the girl next door her prom dress, and she couldn't afford it. I said, well, who's going to pay for all this stuff, right? No concept and no idea, right? Little did I know. But I interrupt you. I'm sorry, but I wanted to say that thing is that we don't know what we don't know. Right. And so not having the right education, the right to have the right role models, which is why these conversations are so important. So we can share. I'm being vulnerable to say that I messed up when I graduated high school, right? James is sharing with his daughter, and we're sharing our best practices. It's these types of stories that we have to tell from generation to generation so that we don't make the same error. We don't make the same mistake. It goes back to Emmett Till and how many, black men can't touch white women because it leads to death. Right, those kinds of things, we have to continue to share those stories. Otherwise, they'll repeat themselves.
Or even today, I mean, I'm the mother of a Black son, and you know, we had to tell him from little boy that, you know, he had to be afraid of the police. He had to make sure that he didn't make any sudden movements, that he said yes or no, sir, and you know, all those kinds of things. And I would tell him, you know, because no one can ever replace you. You know, we can deal with the policeman later. You can get his badge and everything, but you have to come home and tell me the badge number before we can do anything about that. And you need to come home. So,
and I think that's a shock to our white counterparts to know. I had two older brothers, and I remember having a conversation when I was 8. My parents telling me about, you need to obey, respect the police officers. It's going to be belittling. You're going to be vulnerable, but you need to get back home, just as you told your son. You know, but when you ask our white counterparts, when the first time you had the conversation about law enforcement being stopped, they never had it with their children.
No, they didn't have to.
They didn't have to.
I mean, it's just. Yeah, they didn't have to at all. Yeah.
Even as an adult, I'm afraid to even, I'm still as an adult fearful. I was pulled over the other day. I called 911 right away because I didn't know why I was being stopped. And when he pulled me over, he said, I said, you know why I stopped you? I said, no, I don't know why you stopped me. You pulled off after I pulled up behind you. I pulled off because the light turned green. Right. I didn't pull off because I was right. Yeah. I pulled off because the light turned green. You know, and then you pull me over and then you check everything and you says, you know, have a nice year. Because I says, let me know 911, I just called because I don't know why you pulled me over. Right. And so we have to call them on their stuff. Right. We have to figure it out. But there's a code that we have to live under. Right. It's the Black code. We have to live under, sad as it may be. But imagine the fatigue that's created. Right. And imagine how we can't be our full authentic self. Imagine how we will suppress who we are in order just to be in the room, let alone contributes, right? We come at a disadvantage. And I'm not having a pity party. I have been successful in spite of, and many of you have as well. So this is not a pity party. I tell leaders all the time, it's not that Blacks are complaining, they're trying to explain. And you interpret it as they're complaining. We're not trying to be excluded, we want to be included. We're not victims, we're victors. Give us the right playing field. Right. So we're at the top of our hour. You guys have been a phenomenal panel to talk through. You're great leaders and great perspectives on today. This session was designed and created to provide insights, best practices, storytelling on how we can be more effective, how we can conquer the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion to ensure that we're making it better for the next generation, because each generation pays it forward for the next. We encourage you who've listened to this call to do something different, to have a conversation with your children, to invest differently, to look at advertising differently, to keep your credit in line and buy from Black businesses. And tell your friends about this session. We thank you. We appreciate you. God bless and keep you all.